o'clock as he was mounting the hill to Kossuth, carrying his limp book on Bamberg Cathedral. He had not yet thought of Anna, not definitely. The dark finger pressing a bruise controlled him thoughtlessly. Anna had started guiltily when he left the house. She had hastened preparing the tea, hoping he would come back. She had made some toast and got all ready. Then he didn't come. She cried with vexation and disappointment. Why had he gone? Why couldn't he come back now? Why was it such a battle between them? She loved him. She did love him. Why couldn't he be kinder to her, nicer to her? She waited in distress. Then her mood grew harder. He passed out of her thoughts. She had considered indignantly what right he had to interfere with her sewing. She had indignantly refuted his right to interfere with her at all. She was not to be interfered with. Was she not herself, and he the outsider? Yet a quiver of fear went through her. If he should leave her, she sat conjuring fears and sufferings, till she wept with very self-pity. She did not know what she would do if he left her, or if he turned against her. The thought of it chilled her, made her desolate and hard. And against him, the stranger, the outsider, the being who wanted to arrogate authority, she remained steadily fortified. Was she not herself? How could one who was not of her own kind presume with authority? She knew she was immutable, unchangeable. She was not afraid for her own being. She was only afraid of all that was not herself. It pressed round her. It came to her and took part in her, in form of her man, this vast, resounding, alien world which was not herself. And he had so many weapons he might strike from so many sides. When he came in at the door, his heart was blazed with pity and tenderness. She looked so lost and forlorn and young. She glanced up, afraid, and she was surprised to see him, shining-faced, clear and beautiful in his movements, as if he were clarified. And a startled pang of fear and shame of herself went through her. They waited for each other to speak. "Do you want to eat anything?" she said. "I'll get it myself," he answered, not wanting her to serve him. But she brought out food, and it pleased him she did it for him. He was again a bright lord. "I went to Nottingham," he said mildly. "To your mother?" she asked, in a flash of contempt. "No, I didn't go home." "Who did you go to see?" "I went to see nobody." "Then why did you go to Nottingham?" "I went because I wanted to go." He was getting angry that she again rebuffed him when he was so clear and shining. "And who did you see?" "I saw nobody." "Nobody?" "No, who should I see?" "You saw nobody you knew?" "No, I didn't," he replied irritably. She believed him, and her mood became cold. "I bought a book," he said, handing her the propitiatory volume. She idly looked at the pictures. Beautiful, the pure women, with their clear dropping gowns. Her heart became colder. What did they mean to him? He sat and waited for her. She bent over the book. "Aren't they nice?" he said, his voice roused and glad. Her blood flushed, but she did not lift her head. "Yes," she said. In spite of herself, she was compelled by him. He was strange, attractive, exerting some power over her. He came over to her and touched her delicately. Her heart beat with wild passion, wild raging passion. But she resisted as yet. It was always the unknown, and she clung fiercely to her known self. But the rising flood carried her away. They loved each other to transport again, passionately and fully. "Isn't it more wonderful than ever?" she asked him, radiant like a newly opened flower, with tears like dew. He held her closer. He was strange and abstracted. "It is always more wonderful," she asseverated, in a glad, child's voice, remembering her fear, and not quite cleared of it yet. So it went on continually, the recurrence of love and conflict between them. One day it seemed as if everything was shattered, all life spoiled, ruined, desolate, and laid waste. The next day it was all marvelous again, just marvelous. One day she thought she would go mad from his very presence. The sound of his drinking was detestable to her. The next day she loved and rejoiced in the way he crossed the floor. He was sun, moon, and stars in one. She fretted, however, at last, over the lack of stability. When the perfect hours came back, her heart did not forget that they would pass away again. She was uneasy. The surety, the inner surety, the confidence in the abidingness of love. That was what she wanted, and that she did not get. She knew also that he had not got it. Nevertheless, it was a marvelous world. She was for the most part lost in the marvelousness of it. Even her great woes were marvelous to her. She could be very happy, and she wanted to be happy. She resented it when he made her unhappy. Then she could kill him, cast him out. Many days, she waited for the hour when he would be gone to work. Then the flow of her life, which he seemed to dam up, was let loose, and she was free. She was free. She was full of delight. Everything delighted her. She took up the rug and went to shake it in the garden. Patches of snow were on the fields. The air was light. She heard the ducks shouting on the pond. She saw them charge and sail across the water as if they were setting off on an invasion of the world. She watched the rough horses, one of which was clipped smooth on the belly, so that he wore a jacket and long stockings of brown fur, stand kissing each other in the wintry morning by the churchyard wall. Everything delighted her. Now he was gone. The insulator, the obstruction removed, the world was all hers, in connection with her. She was joyfully active. Nothing pleased her more than to hang out the washing in a high wind that came full butt over the round of the hill, tearing the wet garments out of her hands, making flap, flap, flap of the waving stuff. She laughed and struggled and grew angry, but she loved her solitary days. Then he came home at night, and she knitted her brows because of some endless contest between them. As he stood in the doorway, her heart changed. It steeled itself. The laughter and zest of the day disappeared from her. She was stiffened. They fought an unknown battle, unconsciously. Still they were in love with each other. The passion was there. But the passion was consumed in a battle. And the deep, fierce, unnamed battle went on. Everything glowed intensely about them. The world had put off its clothes and was awful, with new, primal nakedness. Sunday came when the strange spell was cast over her by him. Half she loved it. She was becoming more like him. All the weekdays, there was a glint of sky and fields. The little church seemed to babble away to the cottages the morning through. But on Sundays, when he stayed at home, a deeply colored, intense gloom seemed to gather on the face of the earth. The church seemed to fill itself with shadow, to become big, a universe to her. There was a burning of blue and ruby, a sound of worship about her. And when the doors were opened and she came out into the world, it was a world new created. She stepped into the resurrection of the world, her heart beating to the memory of the darkness and the passion. If, as very often, they went to the marsh for tea on Sundays, then she regained another, lighter world that had never known the gloom and the stained glass and the ecstasy of chanting. Her husband was obliterated. She was with her father again, who was so fresh and free and all daylight. Her husband, with his intensity and his darkness, was obliterated. She left him. She forgot him. She accepted her father. Yet, as she went home again with the young man, she put her hand on his arm tentatively, a little bit ashamed. Her hand pleaded that he would not hold it against her, her recusancy. But he was obscured. He seemed to become blind, as if he were not there with her. Then she was afraid. She wanted him. When he was oblivious of her, she almost went mad with fear. For she had become so vulnerable, so exposed. She was in touch so intimately. All things about her had become intimate. She had known them near and lovely, like presences hovering upon her. What if they should all go hard and separate again, standing back from her terrible and distinct, and she, having known them, should be at their mercy? This frightened her. Always, her husband was to her the unknown to which she was delivered up. She was a flower that has been tempted forth into blossom and has no retreat. He had her nakedness in his power. And who was he? What was he? A blind thing, a dark force, without knowledge. She wanted to preserve herself. Then she gathered him to herself again and was satisfied for a moment. But as time went on, she began to realize more and more that he did not alter, that he was something dark, alien to herself. She had thought him just the bright reflex of herself. As the weeks and months went by, she realized that he was a dark opposite to her, that they were opposites, not complements. He did not alter. He remained separately himself, and he seemed to expect her to be part of himself, the extension of his will. She felt him trying to gain power over her, without knowing her. What did he want? Was he going to bully her? What did she want herself? She answered herself that she wanted to be happy, to be natural, like the sunlight and the busy daytime. And, at the bottom of her soul, she felt he wanted her to be dark, unnatural. Sometimes, when he seemed like the darkness covering and smothering her, she revolted almost in horror and struck at him. She struck at him and made him bleed, and he became wicked. Because she dreaded him and held him in horror, he became wicked. He wanted to destroy. And then the fight between them was cruel. She began to tremble. He wanted to impose himself on her, and he began to shudder. She wanted to desert him, to leave him a prey to the open, with the unclean dogs of the darkness setting on to devour him. He must beat her and make her stay with him, whereas she fought to keep herself free of him. They went their ways, now shadowed and stained with blood, feeling the world far off, unable to give help, till she began to get tired. After a certain point, she became impassive, detached utterly from him. He was always ready to burst out murderously against her. Her soul got up and left him. She went her way. Nevertheless, in her apparent blindness, that made his soul black with opposition, she trembled as if she bled. And ever and again, the pure love came in sunbeams between them, when she was like a flower in the sun to him, so beautiful, so shining, so intensely dear that he could scarcely bear it. Then, as if his soul had 6 wings of bliss, he stood absorbed in praise, feeling the radiance from the Almighty beat through him like a pulse, as he stood in the upright flame of praise, transmitting the pulse of creation. And ever and again he appeared to her as the dread flame of power. Sometimes, when he stood in the doorway, his face lit up. He seemed like an annunciation to her. Her heart beat fast, and she watched him, suspended. He had a dark, burning being that she dreaded and resisted. She was subject to him as to the angel of the presence. She waited upon him and heard his will, and she trembled in his service. Then all this passed away. Then he loved her for her childishness and for her strangeness to him, for the wonder of her soul which was different from his soul, and which made him genuine when he would be false. And she loved him for the way he sat loosely in a chair, or for the way he came through a door with his face open and eager. She loved his ringing, eager voice, and the touch of the unknown about him, his absolute simplicity. Yet neither of them was quite satisfied. He felt, somewhere, that she did not respect him. She only respected him as far as he was related to herself. For what he was beyond her, she had no care. She did not care for what he represented in himself. It is true, he did not know himself what he represented, but whatever it was, she did not really honor it. She did no service to his work as a lace designer, nor to himself as breadwinner. Because he went down to the office and worked every day, that entitled him to no respect or regard from her, he knew. Rather, she despised him for it. And he almost loved her for this, though at first it maddened him like an insult. What was much deeper, she soon came to combat his deepest feelings. What he thought about life and about society and mankind did not matter very much to her. He was right enough to be insignificant. This was again galling to him. She would judge beyond him on these things. But at length he came to accept her judgments, discovering them as if they were his own. It was not here the deep trouble lay. The deep root of his enmity lay in the fact that she jeered at his soul. He was inarticulate and stupid in thought, but to some things he clung passionately. He loved the church. If she tried to get out of him what he believed, then they were both soon in a white rage. Did he believe the water turned to wine at Cana? She would drive him to the thing as a historical fact. So much rainwater. Look at it. Can it become grape juice, wine? For an instant, he saw with the clear eyes of the mind and said no. His clear mind, answering her for a moment, rejected the idea. And immediately his whole soul was crying in a mad, inchoate hatred against this violation of himself.
It was true for him.
His mind was extinguished again at once. His blood was up. In his blood and bones, he wanted the scene, the wedding, the water brought forward from the firkins as red wine. And Christ saying to his mother, "Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come." And then his mother saith unto the servants, "Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it." Brangwen loved it. With his bones and blood he loved it. He could not let it go, yet she forced him to let it go. She hated his blind attachments. Water, natural water, could it suddenly and unnaturally turn into wine, depart from its being and at haphazard take on another being? Ah no, he knew it was wrong. She became again the palpitating, hostile child, hateful, putting things to destruction. He became mute and dead. His own being gave him the lie. He knew it was so. Wine was wine, water was water, forever. The water had not become wine. The miracle was not a real fact. She seemed to be destroying him. He went out, dark and destroyed, his soul running its blood. And he tasted of death, because his life was formed in these unquestioned concepts. She, desolate again as she had been when she was a child, went away and sobbed. She did not care. She did not care whether the water had turned to wine or not. Let him believe it if he wanted to. But she knew she had won, and an ashy desolation came over her. They were ashenly miserable for some time. Then the life began to come back.
He was nothing if not dogged.
He thought again of the chapter of St. John. There was a great biting pang. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. The best wine. The young man's heart responded in a craving, in a triumph, although the knowledge that it was not true in fact bit at him like a weasel in his heart. Which was stronger, the pain of the denial, or the desire for affirmation? He was stubborn in spirit, and abode by his desire. But he would not any more affirm the miracles as true. Very well, it was not true. The water had not turned into wine. The water had not turned into wine. But for all that he would live in his soul, as if the water had turned into wine. For truth of fact, it had not. But for his soul, it had. Whether it turned into wine or whether it didn't, he said, "It doesn't bother me. I take it for what it is." "And what is it?" she asked, quickly, hopefully. "It's the Bible," he said. That answer enraged her, and she despised him. She did not actively question the Bible herself, but he drove her to contempt. And yet he did not care about the Bible, the written letter. Although he could not satisfy her, yet she knew of herself that he had something real. He was not a dogmatist. He did not believe in fact that the water turned into wine. He did not want to make a fact out of it. Indeed, his attitude was without criticism. It was purely individual. He took that which was of value to him from the written word. He added to his spirit. His mind he let sleep. And she was bitter against him, that he let his mind sleep. That which was human, belonged to mankind, he would not exert. He cared only for himself. He was no Christian. Above all, Christ had asserted the brotherhood of man. She, almost against herself, clung to the worship of the human knowledge. Man must die in the body, but in his knowledge he was immortal. Such, somewhere, was her belief, quite obscure and unformulated. She believed in the omnipotence of the human mind. He, on the other hand, blind as a subterranean thing, just ignored the human mind and ran after his own dark-souled desires, following his own tunneling nose. She felt often she must suffocate, and she fought him off. Then he, knowing he was blind, fought madly back again, frantic in sensual fear. He did foolish things. He asserted himself on his rights. He arrogated the old position of master of the house. "You've a right to do as I want," he cried. "Fool," she answered. "Fool." "I'll let you know who's master," he cried. "Fool," she answered.
Fool.
"I've known my own father, who could put a dozen of you in his pipe and push them down with his finger end. Don't I know what a fool you are?" He knew himself what a fool he was, and was flayed by the knowledge. Yet, he went on trying to steer the ship of their dual life. He asserted his position as the captain of the ship, and captain and shipboard her. He wanted to loom important as master of one of the innumerable domestic craft that make up the great fleet of society. It seemed to her a ridiculous armada of tubs jostling in futility. She felt no belief in it. She jeered at him as master of the house, master of their dual life. And he was black with shame and rage. He knew, with shame, her father had been a man without arrogating any authority. He had gone on the wrong tack, and he felt it hard to give up the expedition. There was great surging and shame. Then he yielded. He had given up the master of the house idea. There was something he wanted, nevertheless, some form of mastery. Ever and anon, after his collapses into the petty and the shameful, he rose up again and, stubborn in spirit, strong in his power to start afresh, set out once more in his male pride of being to fulfill the hidden passion of his spirit. It began well, but it ended always in war between them, till they were both driven almost to madness. He said she did not respect him. She laughed in hollow scorn of this. For her it was enough that she loved him. Respect what? She asked. But he always answered the wrong thing. And though she cudgeled her brains, she could not come at it. Why don't you go on with your wood carving? She said. Why don't you finish your Adam and Eve? But she did not care for the Adam and Eve, and he never put another stroke to it. She jeered at the Eve, saying, "She is like a little marionette. Why is she so small? You've made Adam as big as God, and Eve like a doll. It is impudence to say that woman was made out of man's body," she continued, "when every man is born of woman. What impudence men have, what arrogance." In a rage one day, after trying to work on the board and failing so that his belly was a flame of nausea, he chopped up the whole panel and put it on the fire. She did not know. He went about for some days very quiet and subdued after it. "Where is the Adam and Eve board?" she asked him. "Burnt." She looked at him. "But your carving?" "I burned it." "When?" She did not believe him. "On Friday night, when I was at the marsh?" "Yes." She said no more. Then, when he had gone to work, she wept for a whole day and was much chastened in spirit, so that a new, fragile flame of love came out of the ashes of this last pain. Directly, it occurred to her that she was with child. There was a great trembling of wonder and anticipation through her soul. She wanted a child. Not that she loved babies so much, though she was touched by all young things, but she wanted to bear children. And a certain hunger in her heart wanted to unite her husband with herself in a child. She wanted a son. She felt a son would be everything. She wanted to tell her husband, but it was such a trembling, intimate thing to tell him, and he was at this time hard and unresponsive, so that she went away and wept. It was such a waste of a beautiful opportunity, such a frost that nipped in the bud one of the beautiful moments of her life. She went about heavy and tremulous with her secret, wanting to touch him, oh, most delicately, and see his face, dark and sensitive, attend to her news. She waited and waited for him to become gentle and still towards her, but he was always harsh and he bullied her, so that the buds shriveled from her confidence. She was chilled. She went down to the marsh. "Well," said her father, looking at her and seeing her at the first glance, "what's amiss, why you now?" The tears came at the touch of his careful love. "Nothing," she said. "Can't you hit it off, you two?" he said. "He's so obstinate," she quivered, but her soul was obdurate itself. I know another who's all that," said her father. She was silent. "You don't want to make yourselves miserable," said her father. "All about Nout." "He isn't miserable," she said. "I'll back my life, if you can do naught else. You can make him as miserable as a dog. You'd be a dab hand at that, my lass." "I do nothing to make him miserable," she retorted. Oh no. A packet, oh, butterscotch, you are." She laughed a little. "You mustn't think I want him to be miserable," she cried. "I don't." "We quite readily believe it," retorted Brangwen. "Neither do you intend him to be hopping for joy, like a fish in a pond." This made her think. She was rather surprised to find that she did not intend her husband to be hopping for joy like a fish in a pond. Her mother came, and they all sat down to tea, talking casually. "Remember, child," said her mother, "that everything is not waiting for your hand just to take or leave. You mustn't expect it. Between two people, the love itself is the important thing, and that is neither you nor him. It is a third thing you must create. You mustn't expect it to be just your way." "Ha, nor do I. If I did, I should soon find my mistake out. If I put my hand out to take anything, my hand is very soon bitten. I can tell you." "Then you must mind where you put your hand," said her father. Anna was rather indignant that they took the tragedy of her young married life with such equanimity. "You love the man right enough," said her father, wrinkling his forehead in distress. "That's all as counts." "I do love him. More shame to him," she cried. "I want to tell him. I've been waiting for 4 days now to tell him." Her face began to quiver. The tears came. Her parents watched her in silence. She did not go on. "Tell him what?" said her father. "That we're going to have an infant," she sobbed. "And he's never let me. Not once. Every time I've come to him, he's been horrid to me, and I wanted to tell him I did. And he won't let me. He's cruel to me." She sobbed as if her heart would break. Her mother went and comforted her, put her arms round her, and held her close. Her father sat with a queer, wrinkled brow and was rather paler than usual. His heart went tense with hatred of his son-in-law. So that, when the tale was sobbed out and comfort administered and tea sipped, and something like calm restored to the little circle, the thought of old Brangwen's entry was not pleasantly entertained. Tilly was set to watch out for him as he passed by on his way home. The little party at table heard the woman servant's shrill call. "You've got to come in, Will. Anna's here." After a few moments, the youth entered. "Are you stopping?" he asked in his hard, harsh voice. He seemed like a blade of destruction standing there. She quivered to tears. "Sit you down," said Tom Brangwen, "and take a bit off your length." Well, Brangwen sat down. He felt something strange in the atmosphere. He was dark-browed, but his eyes had the keen, intent, sharp look, as if he could only see in the distance, which was a beauty in him, and which made Anna so angry. "Why does he always deny me?" she said to herself. "Why is it nothing to him, what I am?" And Tom Brangwen, blue-eyed and warm, sat in opposition to the youth. "How long are you stopping?" the young husband asked his wife. "Not very long," she said. "Get your tea, lad," said Tom Brangwen. "Are you itchin' to be off the moment you enter?" They talked of trivial things. Through the open door, the level rays of sunset poured in, shining on the floor. A gray hen appeared stepping swiftly in the doorway, pecking, and the light through her comb and her wattles made an oriflamme tossed here and there. As she went, her gray body was like a ghost. Anna, watching, threw scraps of bread, and she felt the child flame within her. She seemed to remember again forgotten, burning, far-off things. "Where was I born, Mother?" she asked. "In London." "And was my father?" She spoke of him as if he were merely a strange name. She could never connect herself with him. "Was he dark?" "He had dark brown hair and dark eyes and a fresh coloring. He went bald, rather bald, when he was quite young," replied her mother, also as if telling a tale which was just old imagination. "Was he good-looking?" "Yes, he was very good-looking, rather small. I have never seen an Englishman who looked like him." "Why?" "He was..." The mother made a quick, running movement with her hands. "His figure was alive and changing. It was never fixed. He was not in the least steady, like a running stream." It flashed over the youth. Anna, too, was like a running stream. Instantly, he was in love with her again. Tom Brangwen was frightened. His heart always filled with fear of the unknown, when he heard his women speak of their bygone men as of strangers they had known in passing and had taken leave of again. In the room, there came a silence and a singleness over all their hearts. They were separate people with separate destinies. Why should they seek each to lay violent hands of claim on the other? The young people went home as a sharp little moon was setting in the dusk of spring. Tufts of trees hovered in the upper air. The little church pricked up shadowily at the top of the hill. The earth was a dark blue shadow. She put her hand lightly on his arm, out of her far distance. And out of the distance, he felt her touch him. They walked on, hand in hand, along opposite horizons, touching across the dusk. There was a sound of thrushes calling in the dark blue twilight. "I think we are going to have an infant, Bill," she said from far off. He trembled, and his fingers tightened on hers. "Why?" he asked, his heart beating. "You don't know?" "I do," she said. They continued without saying any more, walking along opposite horizons, hand in hand across the intervening space, two separate people. And he trembled as if a wind blew onto him in strong gusts, out of the unseen. He was afraid. He was afraid to know he was alone, for she seemed fulfilled and separate and sufficient in her half of the world. He could not bear to know that he was cut off. Why could he not be always one with her? It was he who had given her the child. Why could she not be with him, one with him? Why must he be set in this separateness? Why could she not be with him, close, close as one with him? She must be one with him. He held her fingers tightly in his own. She did not know what he was thinking. The blaze of light on her heart was too beautiful and dazzling from the conception in her womb. She walked glorified, and the sound of the thrushes, of the trains in the valley, of the far-off, faint noises of the town, were her Magnificat. But he was struggling in silence. It seemed as though there were before him a solid wall of darkness that impeded him and suffocated him and made him mad. He wanted her to come to him, to complete him, to stand before him so that his eyes should not meet the naked darkness. Nothing mattered to him but that she should come and complete him, for he was ridden by the awful sense of his own limitation. It was as if he ended uncompleted, as yet uncreated on the darkness, and he wanted her to come and liberate him into the whole. But she was complete in herself, and he was ashamed of his need, his helpless need of her. His need, and his shame of need, weighed on him like a madness. Yet still he was quiet and gentle, in reverence of her conception, and because she was with child by him. And she was happy in showers of sunshine. She loved her husband as a presence, as a grateful condition. But for the moment her need was fulfilled, and now she wanted only to hold her husband by the hand in sheer happiness, without taking thought, only being glad. He had various folios of reproductions, and among them a cheap print from Fra Angelico's entry of the blessed into paradise. This filled Anna with bliss. The beautiful, innocent way in which the blessed held each other by the hand as they moved towards the radiance, the real, angelic melody, made her weep with happiness. The floweriness, the beams of light, the linking of hands, was almost too much for her, too innocent. Day after day came shining through the door of paradise. Day after day, she entered into the brightness. The child in her shone till she herself was a beam of sunshine. And how lovely was the sunshine that loitered and wandered out of doors, where the catkins on the big hazel bushes at the end of the garden hung in their shaken, floating aureole, where little fumes like fire burst out from the black yew trees as a bird settled clinging to the branches. One day bluebells were along the hedge bottoms, then cowslips twinkled like manna, golden and evanescent on the meadows. She was full of a rich drowsiness and loneliness. How happy she was, how gorgeous it was to live, to have known herself, her husband, the passion of love and begetting, and to know that all this lived and waited and burned on around her, a terrible purifying fire, through which she had passed for once to come to this peace of golden radiance, when she was with child and innocent, and in love with her husband, and with all the many angels hand in hand. She lifted her throat to the breeze that came across the fields, and she felt it handling her like sisters fondling her. She drank it in perfume of cowslips and of apple blossoms. And in all the happiness a black shadow, shy, wild, a beast of prey, roamed and vanished from sight, and like strands of gossamer blown across her eyes, there was a dread for her. She was afraid when he came home at night. As yet, her fear never spoke, The shadow never rushed upon her. He was gentle, humble. He kept himself withheld. His hands were delicate upon her, and she loved them. But there ran through her the thrill, crisp as pain, for she felt the darkness and other worlds still in his soft, sheathed hands. But the summer drifted in with the silence of a miracle. She was almost always alone. All the while went on the long, lovely drowsiness. The maiden blush roses in the garden were all shed, washed away in a pouring rain. Summer drifted into autumn, and the long, vague, golden days began to close. Crimson clouds fumed about the west, and as night came on, all the sky was fuming and steaming, and the moon, far above the swiftness of vapors, was white, bleared. The night was uneasy. Suddenly the moon would appear at a clear window in the sky, looking down from far above, like a captive, and Anna did not sleep. There was a strange, dark tension about her husband. She became aware that he was trying to force his will upon her. There was something he wanted, as he lay there dark and tense. And her soul sighed in weariness. Everything was so vague and lovely, and he wanted to wake her up to the hard, hostile reality. She drew back in resistance. Still he said nothing, but she felt his power persisting on her till she became aware of the strain. She cried out against the exhaustion. He was forcing her, and she wanted so much the joy and the vagueness and the innocence of her pregnancy. She did not want his bitter, corrosive love. She did not want it poured into her, to burn her. Why must she have it? Why was he not contained? She sat many hours by the window, in those days when he drove her most with the black constraint of his will, and she watched the rain falling on the yew trees. She was not sad, only wistful, blanched. The child under her heart was a perpetual warmth, and she was sure the pressure was only upon her from the outside. Her soul had no stripes. Yet in her heart itself was always this same strain, tense, anxious. She was not safe. She was always exposed. She was always attacked. There was a yearning in her for a fullness of peace and blessedness. What a heavy yearning it was, so heavy. She knew, vaguely, that all the time he was not satisfied, all the time he was trying to force something from her. How she wished she could succeed with him, in her own way. He was there, so inevitable. She lived in him also. And how she wanted to be at peace with him, at peace. She loved him. She would give him love, pure love. With a strange, rapt look in her face, she awaited his homecoming that night. Then, when he came, she rose with her hands full of love, as of flowers, radiant, innocent. A dark spasm crossed his face. As she watched, her face shining and flower-like with innocent love, his face grew dark and tense. The cruelty gathered in his brows. His eyes turned aside. She saw the whites of his eyes as he looked aside from her. She waited, touching him with her hands. But from his body through her hands came the bitter corrosive shock of his passion upon her, destroying her in blossom. She shrank. She rose from her knees and went away from him to preserve herself. And it was great pain to her. To him also it was agony. He saw the glistening, flower-like love in her face, and his heart was black because he did not want it. Not this, not this. He did not want flowery innocence. He was unsatisfied. The rage and storm of unsatisfaction tormented him ceaselessly. Why had she not satisfied him? He had satisfied her. She was satisfied, at peace, innocent round the doors of her own paradise. And he was unsatisfied, unfulfilled. He raged in torment, wanting. It was for her to satisfy him. Then let her do it. Let her not come with flowery handfuls of innocent love. He would throw these aside and trample the flowers to nothing. He would destroy her flowery, innocent bliss. Was he not entitled to satisfaction from her, and was not his heart all raging desire, his soul a black torment of unfulfillment? Let it be fulfilled in him, then, as it was fulfilled in her. He had given her her fulfillment. Let her rise up and do her part. He was cruel to her, but all the time he was ashamed. And being ashamed, he was more cruel. for he was ashamed that he could not come to fulfillment without her. And he could not, and she would not heed him. He was shackled and in darkness of torment. She beseeched him to work again, to do his wood carving, but his soul was too black. He had destroyed his panel of Adam and Eve. He could not begin again, least of all now, whilst he was in this condition. For her there was no final release, since he could not be liberated from himself. Strange and amorphous, she must go yearning on through the trouble, like a warm, glowing cloud blown in the middle of a storm. She felt so rich in her warm vagueness that her soul cried out on him, because he harried her and wanted to destroy her. She had her moments of exaltation still, rebirths of old exaltations. As she sat by her bedroom window, watching the steady rain, her spirit was somewhere far off. She sat in pride and curious pleasure, when there was no one to exult with, and the unsatisfied soul must dance and play. Then one danced before the unknown. Suddenly she realized that this was what she wanted to do. Big with child as she was, she danced there in the bedroom by herself, lifting her hands and her body to the unseen creator who had chosen her, to whom she belonged. She would not have had anyone know. She danced in secret, and her soul rose in bliss. She danced in secret before the Creator. She took off her clothes and danced in the pride of her bigness. It surprised her when it was over. She was shrinking and afraid. To what was she now exposed? She half wanted to tell her husband, yet she shrank from him. All the time she ran on by herself. She liked the story of David, who danced before the Lord and uncovered himself exultingly. Why should he uncover himself to Michal, a common woman? He uncovered himself to the Lord. Thou comest to me with a sword and a spear and a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Her heart rang to the words. She walked in her pride, and her battle was her own Lord's. Her husband was delivered over. In these days she was oblivious of him. Who was he to come against her? No, he was not even the Philistine, the giant. He was like Saul proclaiming his own kingship. She laughed in her heart. Who was he, proclaiming his kingship? She laughed in her heart with pride. And she had to dance in exultation beyond him. Because he was in the house, she had to dance before her Creator in exemption from the man. On a Saturday afternoon, when she had a fire in the bedroom, again she took off her things and danced, lifting her knees and her hands in a slow, rhythmic exulting. He was in the house, so her pride was fiercer. She would dance his nullification. She would dance to her unseen Lord. She was exalted over him, before the Lord. She heard him coming up the stairs, and she flinched. She stood with the firelight on her ankles and feet, naked in the shadowy, late afternoon, fastening up her hair. He was startled. He stood in the doorway, his brows black and lowering. "What are you doing?" he said gratingly. "You'll catch a cold." And she lifted her hands and danced again, to annul him. The light glanced on her knees as she made her slow, fine movements down the far side of the room, across the firelight. He stood away near the door in blackness of shadow, watching, transfixed. And with slow, heavy movements, she swayed backwards and forwards, like a full ear of corn, pale in the dusky afternoon, threading before the firelight, dancing his non-existence, dancing herself to the Lord, to exaltation. He watched, and his soul burned in him. He turned aside. He could not look. It hurt his eyes. Her fine limbs lifted and lifted. Her hair was sticking out all fierce, and her belly, big, strange, terrifying, uplifted to the Lord. Her face was rapt and beautiful. She danced exulting before her Lord, and knew no man. It hurt him as he watched, as if he were at the stake. He felt he was being burned alive. The strangeness, the power of her and her dancing consumed him. He was burned. He could not grasp. He could not understand. He waited obliterated. Then his eyes became blind to her. He saw her no more. And through the unseeing veil between them, he called to her, in his jarring voice. "What are you doing that for?" "Go away," she said. "Let me dance by myself." "That isn't dancing," he said harshly. "What do you want to do that for?" I don't do it for you, she said. You go away. Her strange, lifted belly, big with his child. Had he no right to be there? He felt his presence a violation. Yet he had his right to be there. He went and sat on the bed. She stopped dancing and confronted him, again lifting her slim arms and twisting at her hair. Her nakedness hurt her, opposed to him. I can do as I like in my bedroom, she cried. Why do you interfere with me? And she slipped on a dressing gown and crouched before the fire. He was more at ease now she was covered up. The vision of her tormented him all the days of his life, as she had been then, a strange, exalted thing having no relation to himself. After this day, the door seemed to shut on his mind. His brow shut and became impervious. His eyes ceased to see, his hands were suspended. Within himself his will was coiled like a beast, hidden under the darkness, but always potent, working. At first, she went on blithely enough with him shut down beside her. But then his spell began to take hold of her. The dark, seething potency of him, the power of a creature that lies hidden and exerts its will to the destruction of the free-running creature, as the tiger lying in the darkness of the leaves steadily enforces the fall and death of the light creatures that drink by the waterside in the morning, gradually began to take effect on her. Though he lay there in his darkness and did not move, yet she knew he lay waiting for her. She felt his will fastening on her and pulling her down, even whilst he was silent and obscure. She found that in all her outgoings and her incomings, he prevented her. Gradually she realized that she was being borne down by him, borne down by the clinging, heavy weight of him, that he was pulling her down as a leopard clings to a wild cow and exhausts her and pulls her down. Gradually she realized that her life, her freedom, was sinking under the silent grip of his physical will. He wanted her in his power. He wanted to devour her at leisure, to have her. At length she realized that her sleep was a long ache and a weariness and exhaustion because of his will fastened upon her as he lay there beside her during the night. She realized it all, and there came a momentous pause, a pause in her swift running, a moment's suspension in her life, when she was lost. Then she turned fiercely on him and fought him. He was not to do this to her. It was monstrous. What horrible hold did he want to have over her body? Why did he want to drag her down and kill her spirit? Why did he want to deny her spirit? Why did he deny her spirituality, hold her for a body only? And was he to claim her carcass? Some vast, hideous darkness he seemed to represent to her. What do you do to me? She cried. What beastly thing do you do to me? You put a horrible pressure on my head. You don't let me sleep. You don't let me live. Every moment of your life you are doing something to me, something horrible that destroys me. There is something horrible in you, something dark and beastly in your will.
What do you want of me? What do you want to do to me?
All the blood in his body went black and powerful and corrosive as he heard her. Black and blind with hatred of her he was. He was in a very black hell and could not escape. He hated her for what she said. Did he not give her everything? Was she not everything to him? And the shame was a bitter fire in him, that she was everything to him, that he had nothing but her. And then that she should taunt him with it, that he could not escape. The fire went black in his veins. For try as he might, he could not escape. She was everything to him. She was his life and his derivation. He depended on her. If she were taken away, he would collapse as a house from which the central pillar is removed. And she hated him because he depended on her so utterly. He was horrible to her. She wanted to thrust him off, to set him apart. It was horrible that he should cleave to her, so close, like leopard that had leapt on her, and fastened. He went on from day to day in a blackness of rage and shame and frustration. How he tortured himself to be able to get away from her, but he could not. She was as the rock on which he stood, with deep, heaving water all round, and he was unable to swim. He must take a stand on her. He must depend on her. What had he in life? Save her? Nothing. The rest was a great heaving flood. The terror of the night of heaving, overwhelming flood, which was his vision of life without her, was too much for him. He clung to her fiercely and abjectly, and she beat him off, She beat him off. Where could he turn, like a swimmer in a dark sea, beaten off from his hold? Whither could he turn? He wanted to leave her. He wanted to be able to leave her. For his soul's sake, for his manhood's sake. He must be able to leave her. But for what? She was the ark, and the rest of the world was flood. The only tangible, secure thing was the woman. He could leave her only for another woman. And where was the other woman? And who was the other woman? Besides, he would be just in the same state. Another woman would be woman. The case would be the same. Why was she the all, the everything? Why must he live only through her? Why must he sink if he were detached from her? Why must he cleave to her in a frenzy, as for his very life? The only other way to leave her was to die. The only straight way to leave her was to die. His dark, raging soul knew that. But he had no desire for death. Why could he not leave her? Why could he not throw himself into the hidden water to live or die, as might be? He could not. But supposing he went away right away and found work and had a lodging again, he could be again as he had been before. But he knew he could not. A woman, he must have a woman. And having a woman, he must be free of her. It would be the same position, for he could not be free of her. For how can a man stand unless he have something sure under his feet? Can a man tread the unstable water all his life and call that standing? Better give in and drown at once. And upon what could he stand, save upon a woman? Was he then like the old man of the seas, impotent to move save upon the back of another life? Was he impotent, or a cripple, or a defective, or a fragment? It was black, mad, shameful torture, the frenzy of fear, the frenzy of desire, and the horrible, grasping backwash of shame. What was he afraid of? Why did life, without Anna, seem to him just a horrible welter, everything jostling in a meaningless, dark, fathomless flood? Why, if Anna left him even for a week, did he seem to be clinging like a madman to the edge of reality and slipping surely into the flood of unreality that would drown him? This horrible slipping into unreality drove him mad. His soul screamed with fear and agony. Yet she was pushing him off from her, pushing him away, breaking his fingers from their hold on her, persistently, ruthlessly. He wanted her to have pity, and sometimes for a moment she had pity, but she always began again, thrusting him off into the deep water, into the frenzy and agony of uncertainty. She became like a fury to him, without any sense of him. Her eyes were bright with a cold, unmoving hatred. Then his heart seemed to die in its last fear. She might push him off into the deeps. She would not sleep with him anymore. She said he destroyed her sleep. Up started all his frenzy and madness of fear and suffering. She drove him away. Like a cowed, lurking devil he was driven off, his mind working cunningly against her, devising evil for her. But she drove him off. In his moments of intense suffering, she seemed to him inconceivable, a monster, the principle of cruelty. However her pity might give way for moments, she was hard and cold as a jewel. He must be put off from her. She must sleep alone. She made him a bed in the small room, and he lay there whipped, his soul whipped almost to death, yet unchanged. He lay in agony of suffering, thrown back into unreality, like a man thrown overboard into a sea, to swim till he sinks, because there is no hold, only a wide, weltering sea. He did not sleep, save for the white sleep, when a thin veil is drawn over the mind. It was not sleep. He was awake, and he was not awake. He could not be alone. He needed to be able to put his arms round her. He could not bear the empty space against his breast, where she used to be. He could not bear it. He felt as if he were suspended in space, held there by the grip of his will. If he relaxed, his will would fall through endless space into the bottomless pit, always falling, will-less, helpless, non-existent, just dropping to extinction, falling till the fire of friction had burned out, like a falling star, then nothing, complete nothing. He rose in the morning gray and unreal, and she seemed fond of him again. She seemed to make up to him a little. "I slept well," she said, with her slightly false brightness. "Did you?" "All right," he answered. He would never tell her. For 3 or 4 nights he lay alone through the white sleep, his will unchanged, still tense, fixed in its grip. Then, as if she were revived and free to be fond of him again, deluded by his silence and seeming acquiescence, moved also by pity, she took him back again. Each night, in spite of all the shame, he had waited with agony for bedtime to see if she would shut him out. And each night, as, in her false brightness, she said good night, he felt he must kill her or himself. But she asked for her kiss, so pathetically, so prettily. So he kissed her, whilst his heart was ice. And sometimes he went out. Once he sat for a long time in the church porch before going into bed. It was dark with a wind blowing. He sat in the church porch and felt some shelter, some security. But it grew cold, and he must go into bed. Then came the night when she said, putting her arms round him and kissing him fondly, "Stay with me tonight, will you?" And he had stayed without demur. But his will had not altered. He would have her fixed to him. So that soon she told him again, she must be alone. "I don't want to send you away. I want to sleep with you. But I can't sleep. You don't let me sleep." His blood turned black in his veins.
What do you mean by such a thing?
"It's an arrant lie. I don't let you sleep. But you don't. I sleep so well when I'm alone. And I can't sleep when you're there. You do something to me, you put a pressure on my head, and I must sleep. Now the child is coming." "It's something in yourself," he replied, "something wrong in you." Horrible in the extreme were these nocturnal combats, when all the world was asleep, and they too were alone, alone in the world, and repelling each other. It was hardly to be borne. He went and lay down alone, and at length, after a gray and livid and ghastly period, he relaxed. Something gave way in him. He let go. He did not care what became of him. Strange and dim he became to himself, to her, to everybody. A vagueness had come over everything, like a drowning. And it was an infinite relief to drown, a relief, a great, great relief. He would insist no more. He would force her no more. He would force himself upon her no more. He would let go, relax, lapse, and what would be, should be. Yet he wanted her still. He always, always wanted her. In his soul, he was desolate as a child. He was so helpless. Like a child on its mother, he depended on her for his living. He knew it, and he knew he could hardly help it. Yet he must be able to be alone. He must be able to lie down alongside the empty space and let be. He must be able to leave himself to the flood, to sink or live as might be. For he recognized at length his own limitation and the limitation of his power. He had to give in. There was a stillness, a wanness between them. Half at least of the battle was over. Sometimes she wept as she went about. Her heart was very heavy. But the child was always warm in her womb. They were friends again, new, subdued friends, but there was a wanness between them. They slept together once more, very quietly and distinct, not one together as before. And she was intimate with him, as at first, but he was very quiet and not intimate. He was glad in his soul, but for the time being he was not alive. He could sleep with her and let her be. He could be alone now. He had just learned what it was to be able to be alone. It was right and peaceful. She had given him a new, deeper freedom. The world might be a welter of uncertainty, but he was himself now. He had come into his own existence. He was born for a second time, born at last unto himself, out of the vast body of humanity. Now, at last he had a separate identity. He existed alone, even if he were not quite alone. Before he had only existed in so far as he had relations with another being. Now he had an absolute self as well as a relative self. But it was a very dumb, weak, helpless self, a crawling nursling. He went about very quiet and, in a way, submissive. He had an unalterable self at last, free, separate, independent. She was relieved. She was free of him. She had given him to himself. She wept sometimes with tiredness and helplessness, but he was a husband, and she seemed, in the child that was coming, to forget. It seemed to make her warm and drowsy. She lapsed into a long muse, indistinct, warm, vague, unwilling to be taken out of her vagueness. And she rested on him also. Sometimes she came to him with a strange light in her eyes, poignant, pathetic, as if she were asking for something. He looked, and he could not understand. She was so beautiful, so visionary. The rays seemed to go out of his breast to her, like a shining. He was there for her, all for her, and she would hold his breast and kiss it, kneeling beside him, she who was waiting for the hour of her delivery. And he would lie looking down at his breast, till it seemed that his breast was not himself, that he had left it lying there. Yet it was himself also, and beautiful and bright with her kisses. He was glad with a strange, radiant pain, whilst she kneeled beside him and kissed his breast with a slow, rapt, half-devotional movement. He knew she wanted something. His heart yearned to give it her. His heart yearned over her. And as she lifted her face, that was radiant and rosy as a little cloud, his heart still yearned over her, and, now from the distance, adored her. She had a flower-like presence which he adored as he stood far off, a stranger. The weeks passed on. The time drew near. They were very gentle and delicately happy. The insistent, passionate, dark soul, the powerful unsatisfaction in him seemed stilled and tamed. The lion lay down with the lamb in him. She loved him very much indeed, and he waited near her. She was a precious, remote thing to him at this time, as she waited for her child. Her soul was glad with an ecstasy because of the coming infant. She wanted a boy. Oh, very much she wanted a boy. But she seemed so young and so frail. She was indeed only a girl. As she stood by the fire washing herself, she was proud to wash herself at this time, and he looked at her. His heart was full of extreme tenderness for her. Such fine limbs, her slim, round arms like chasing lights, and her legs so simple and childish, yet so very proud. Oh, she stood on proud legs, with a lovely reckless balance of her full belly and the adorable little roundnesses and the breasts becoming important. Above it all, her face was like a rosy cloud shining. How proud she was! What a lovely proud thing her young body. And she loved him to put his hand on her ripe fullness, so that he should thrill also with the stir and the quickening there. He was afraid and silent, but she flung her arms round his neck with proud, impudent joy. The pains came on, and oh, how she cried. She would have him stay with her. And after her long cries, she would look at him, with tears in her eyes and a sobbing laugh on her face, saying, "I don't mind it really. It was bad enough." But to her it was never deathly. Even the fierce, tearing pain was exhilarating. She screamed and suffered, but was all the time curiously alive and vital. She felt so powerfully alive and in the hands of such a masterly force of life that her bottommost feeling was one of exhilaration. She knew she was winning. She was always winning. With each onset of pain, she was nearer to victory. Probably he suffered more than she did. He was not shocked or horrified, but he was screwed very tight in the vice of suffering. It was a girl. The second of silence on her face, when they said so showed him she was disappointed, and a great blazing passion of resentment and protest sprang up in his heart. In that moment he claimed the child. But when the milk came and the infant sucked her breast, she seemed to be leaping with extravagant bliss. It sucks me, it likes me, oh, it loves it," she cried, holding the child to her breast with her two hands covering it passionately. And in a few moments, as she became used to her bliss, she looked at the youth with glowing, unseeing eyes and said, "Anna Victrix." He went away, trembling, and slept. To her, her pains were the wound smart of a victor. She was the prouder. When she was well again, she was very happy. She called the baby Ursula. Both Anna and her husband felt they must have a name that gave them private satisfaction. The baby was tawny-skinned. It had a curious downy skin and wisps of bronze hair and the yellow-gray eyes that wavered and then became golden brown like the father's. So they called her Ursula because of the picture of the saint. It was a rather delicate baby at first, but soon it became stronger and was restless as a young eel. Anna was worn out with the day-long wrestling with its young vigor. As a little animal, she loved and adored it and was happy. She loved her husband. She kissed his eyes and nose and mouth and made much of him. She said his limbs were beautiful. She was fascinated by the physical form of him. And she was indeed Anna Victrix. He could not combat her anymore. He was out in the wilderness, alone with her. Having occasion to go to London, he marveled, as he returned, thinking of naked, lurking savages on an island, how these had built up and created the great mass of Oxford Street or Piccadilly. How had helpless savages, running with their spears on the riverside, after fish, how had they come to rear up this great London, the ponderous, massive, ugly superstructure of a world of man upon a world of nature. It frightened and awed him. Man was terrible, awful in his works. The works of man were more terrible than man himself, almost monstrous. And yet, for his own part, for his private being, Brangwen felt that the whole of the man's world was exterior and extraneous to his own real life with Anna. Sweep away the whole monstrous superstructure of the world of today, cities and industries and civilization. Leave only the bare earth with plants growing and waters running, and he would not mind, so long as he were whole, had Anna and the child and the new, strange certainty in his soul. Then, if he were naked, he would find clothing somewhere, he would make a shelter and bring food to his wife. And what more? What more would be necessary? The great mass of activity in which mankind was engaged meant nothing to him. By nature, he had no part in it.
What did he live for, then?
For Anna only. And for the sake of living, what did he want on this earth? Anna only, and his children. And his life with his children and her? Was there no more? He was attended by a sense of something more, something further, which gave him absolute being. It was as if now he existed in eternity, let time be what it might. What was there outside? The fabricated world that he did not believe in? What should he bring to her from outside? Nothing? Was it enough, as it was? He was troubled in his acquiescence. She was not with him. Yet he scarcely believed in himself, apart from her, though the whole infinite was with him. Let the whole world slide down, and over the edge of oblivion, he would stand alone. But he was unsure of her, and he existed also in her. So he was unsure. He hovered near to her, never quite able to forget the vague, haunting uncertainty that seemed to challenge him, and which he would not hear. A pang of dread, almost guilt, as of insufficiency, would go over him as he heard her talking to the baby. She stood before the window, with the month-old child in her arms, talking in a musical, young sing-song that he had not heard before, and which rang on his heart like a claim from the distance, or the voice of another world sounding its claim on him. He stood near, listening, and his heart surged to rise and submit. Then it shrank back and stayed aloof. He could not move. A denial was upon him, as if he could not deny himself. He must be himself. "Look at the silly blue caps, my beauty," she crooned, holding up the infant to the window, where shone the white garden and the blue tits scuffling in the snow. "Look at the silly blue caps, my darling, having a fight in the snow. Look at them, my bird, beating the snow about with their wings and shaking their heads. Oh, aren't they wicked things, wicked things? Look at their yellow feathers on the snow there. They'll miss them, won't they, when they're cold later on? Must we tell them to stop? Must we say stop it to them, my bird? But they are naughty, naughty. Look at them." Suddenly her voice broke loud and fierce. She rapped the pane sharply. "Stop it," she cried. "Stop it, you little nuisances. Stop it." She called louder and rapped the pane more sharply. Her voice was fierce and imperative. "Have more sense," she cried. "There, now they're gone. Where have they gone, the silly things? What will they say to each other? What will they say, my lambkin? They'll forget, won't they? They'll forget all about it, out of their silly little heads and their blue caps." After a moment, she turned her bright face to her husband. "They were really fighting. They were really fierce with each other," she said, her voice keen with excitement and wonder, as if she belonged to the bird's world, were identified with the race of birds. They'll fight. Well, blue caps, he said, glad when she turned to him with her glow from elsewhere. He came and stood beside her and looked out at the marks on the snow where the birds had scuffled, and at the yew trees burdened white and black branches. What was the appeal it made to him? What was the question of her bright face? What was the challenge he was called to answer?
He did not know.
But as he stood there, he felt some responsibility which made him glad, but uneasy, as if he must put out his own light. And he could not move as yet. Anna loved the child very much. Oh, very much. Yet still she was not quite fulfilled. She had a slight expectant feeling, as of a door half opened. Here she was, safe and still in Kossuth, but she felt as if she were not in Kossuth at all. She was straining her eyes to something beyond. And from her Pisgah Mount, which she had attained, what could she see? A faint, gleaming horizon, a long way off, and a rainbow like an archway. A shadow door with faintly colored coping above it. Must she be moving thither? Something she did not grasp, could not arrive at. There was something beyond her. But why must she start on the journey? She stood so safely on the Pisgah Mountain. In the winter, when she rose with the sunrise, and out of the back windows saw the east flaming yellow and orange above the green, glowing grass, while the great pear tree in between stood dark and magnificent as an idol, and under the dark pear tree, the little sheet of water spread smooth and burnished, yellow light, she said, "It is here." And when, at evening, the sunset came in a red glare through the big opening in the clouds, she said again, "It is beyond." Dawn and sunset were the feet of the rainbow that spanned the day, and she saw the hope, the promise. Why should she travel any further? Yet she always asked the question. As the sun went down in his fiery winter haste, she faced the blazing close of the affair, in which she had not played her fullest part, and she made her demand still. "What are you doing, making this big, shining commotion? What is it that you keep so busy about, that you will not let us alone?" She did not turn to her husband, for him to lead her. He was apart from her, with her, according to her different conceptions of him. The child she might hold up. She might toss the child forward into the furnace. The child might walk there, amid the burning coals and the incandescent roar of heat, as the three witnesses walked with the angel in the fire. Soon, she felt sure of her husband. She knew his dark face and the extent of its passion. She knew his slim, vigorous body. She said it was hers. Then there was no denying her. She was a rich woman enjoying her riches. And soon again, she was with child, which made her satisfied and took away her discontent. She forgot that she had watched the sun climb up and pass his way, a magnificent traveler surging forward. She forgot that the moon had looked through a window of the high, dark night and nodded like a magic recognition, signaled to her to follow. Sun and moon traveled on and left her, passed her by, a rich woman enjoying her riches. She should go also, but she could not go when they called because she must stay at home now. With satisfaction, she relinquished the adventure to the unknown. She was bearing her children. There was another child coming, and Anna lapsed into vague content. If she were not the wayfarer to the unknown, if she were arrived now, settled in her builded house, a rich woman, still her doors opened under the arch of the rainbow, her threshold reflected the passing of the sun and moon, the great travelers, her house was full of the echo of journeying. She was a door and a threshold, she herself. Through her another soul was coming, to stand upon her as upon the threshold, looking out, shading its eyes for the direction to take. 7. The Cathedral. During the first year of her marriage, before Ursula was born, Anna Brangwen and her husband went to visit her mother's friend, the Baron Skrbensky. The latter had kept a slight connection with Anna's mother and had always preserved some officious interest in the young girl, because she was a pure Pole. When Baron Skrbensky was about 40 years old, his wife died and left him raving, disconsolate. Lydia had visited him then, taking Anna with her. It was when the girl was 14 years old. Since then, she had not seen him. She remembered him as a small, sharp clergyman who cried and talked and terrified her, whilst her mother was most strangely consoling in a foreign language. The little baron never quite approved of Anna because she spoke no Polish. Still, he considered himself in some way her guardian on Lenski's behalf, and he presented her with some old, heavy Russian jewelry, the least valuable of his wife's relics. Then he lapsed out of the Brangwen's life again, though he lived only about 30 miles away. 3 years later came the startling news that he had married a young English girl of good family. Everybody marveled. Then came a copy of the history of the parish of Brieswell by Rudolf Baron Skrbensky, vicar of Brieswell. It was a curious book, incoherent, full of interesting exhumations. It was dedicated to my wife, Millicent Maud Pierce, in whom I embrace the generous spirit of England. If he embraces no more than the spirit of England, said Tom Brangwen, it's a bad lookout for him. But paying a formal visit with his wife, he found the new Baroness a little, creamy-skinned, insidious thing with red-brown hair and a mouth that one must always watch because it curved back continually in an incomprehensible, strange laugh that exposed her rather prominent teeth. She was not beautiful, yet Tom Brangwen was immediately under her spell. She seemed to snuggle like a kitten within his warmth, whilst she was at the same time elusive and ironical, suggesting the fine steel of her claws. The Baron was almost dotingly courteous and attentive to her. She, almost mockingly, yet quite happy, let him dote. Curious little thing she was, she had the soft, creamy, elusive beauty of a ferret. Tom Brangwen was quite at a loss, at her mercy, and she laughed, a little breathlessly, as if tempted to cruelty. She did put fine torments on the elderly Baron. When some months later she bore a son, the Baron Skrbensky was loud with delight. Gradually she gathered a circle of acquaintances in the county, for she was of good family, half Venetian, educated in Dresden. The little foreign vicar attained to a social status which almost satisfied his maddened pride. Therefore the Brangwens were surprised when the invitation came for Anna and her young husband to pay a visit to Brieswell Vicarage. For the Skrbensky's were now moderately well off, Millicent Skrbensky having some fortune of her own. Anna took her best clothes, recovered her best high school manner, and arrived with her husband, while Brangwen, ruddy, bright, with long limbs and a small head, like some uncouth bird, was not changed in the least. The little Baroness was smiling, showing her teeth. She had a real charm, a kind of joyous coldness, laughing, delighted, like some weasel. Anna at once respected her, and was on her guard before her, instinctively attracted by the strange, childlike surety of the Baroness, yet mistrusting it, fascinated. The little Baron was now quite white-haired, very brittle. He was wizened and wrinkled, yet fiery, unsubdued. Anna looked at his lean body, at his small, fine lean legs and lean hands as he sat talking, and she flushed. She recognized the quality of the male in him, his lean, concentrated age, his informed fire, his faculty for sharp, deliberate response. He was so detached, so purely objective. A woman was thoroughly outside him. There was no confusion. So he could give that fine, deliberate response. He was something separate and interesting, his hard, intrinsic being, whittled down by age to an essentiality and a directness almost deathlike, cruel, was yet so unswervingly sure in its action, so distinct in its surety, that she was attracted to him. She watched his cool, hard, separate fire, fascinated by it. Would she rather have it than her husband's diffuse heat, than his blind, hot youth? She seemed to be breathing high, sharp air, as if she had just come out of a hot room. These strange Skrbensky's made her aware of another, freer element, in which each person was detached and isolated. Was not this her natural element? Was not the close Brangwen life stifling her? Meanwhile, the little Baroness, with always a subtle light stirring of her full, lustrous, hazel eyes, was playing with Will Brangwen. He was not quick enough to see all her movements, yet he watched her steadily, with unchanging lit-up eyes. She was a strange creature to him, but she had no power over him. She flushed and was irritated, yet she glanced again and again at his dark, living face, curiously, as if she despised him. She despised his uncritical, unironical nature. It had nothing for her, yet it angered her as if she were jealous. He watched her with deferential interest, as he would watch a stoat playing. But he himself was not implicated. He was different in kind. She was all lambent, biting flames. He was a red fire glowing steadily. She could get nothing out of him, so she made him flush darkly by assuming a biting, subtle class superiority. He flushed, but still he did not object. He was too different. Her little boy came in with the nurse. He was a quick, slight child, with fine perceptiveness and a cool transitoriness in his interest. At once he treated Brangwen as an outsider. He stayed by Anna for a moment, acknowledged her, then was gone again, quick, observant, restless, with a glance of interest at everything. The father adored him and spoke to him in Polish. It was queer, the stiff, aristocratic manner of the father with the child, the distance in the relationship, the classic fatherhood on the one hand, the filial subordination on the other. They played together in their different degrees, very separate, two different beings, differing as it were in rank rather than in relationship. And the Baroness smiled, 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 always smiled, showing her rather protruding teeth, having always a mysterious attraction and charm. Anna realized how different her own life might have been, how different her own living. Her soul stirred. She became as another person. Her intimacy with her husband passed away, the curious enveloping Brangwen intimacy, so warm, so close, so stifling, when one seemed always to be in contact with the other person like a blood relation, was annulled. She denied it, this close relationship with her young husband. He and she were not one. His heat was not always to suffuse her through her mind and her individuality, till she was of one heat with him, till she had not her own self apart. She wanted her own life. He seemed to lap her and suffuse her with his being, his hot life, till she did not know whether she were herself, or whether she were another creature, united with him in a world of close blood intimacy that closed over her and excluded her from all the cool outside. She wanted her own, old, sharp self, detached, active but not absorbed, active for her own part, taking and giving but never absorbed. Whereas he wanted this strange absorption with her, which still she resisted, but she was partly helpless against it. She had lived so long in Tom Brangwen's love beforehand. From the Skrebenskys, they went to Brangwen's beloved Lincoln Cathedral because it was not far off. He had promised her that one by one, they should visit all the cathedrals of England. They began with Lincoln, which he knew well. He began to get excited as the time drew near to set off. What was it that changed him so much? She was almost angry, coming as she did from the Skrebenskys. But now he ran on alone. His very breast seemed to open its doors to watch for the great church brooding over the town. His soul ran ahead. When he saw the cathedral in the distance, dark blue lifted watchful in the sky, his heart leapt. It was the sign in heaven. It was the spirit hovering like a dove, like an eagle over the earth. He turned his glowing, ecstatic face to her, his mouth opened with a strange, ecstatic grin. "There she is," he said. The she irritated her. Why she?
It was it.
What was the cathedral? A big building, a thing of the past, obsolete, to excite him to such a pitch. She began to stir herself to readiness. They passed up the steep hill, he eager as a pilgrim arriving at the shrine. As they came near the precincts, with castle on one side and cathedral on the other, his veins seemed to break into fiery blossom. He was transported. They had passed through the gate, and the great west front was before them, with all its breadth and ornament. "It is a false front," he said, looking at the golden stone and the twin towers, and loving them just the same. In a little ecstasy, he found himself in the porch, on the brink of the unrevealed. He looked up to the lovely unfolding of the stone. He was to pass within to the perfect womb. Then he pushed open the door, and the great, pillared gloom was before him, in which his soul shuddered and rose from her nest. His soul leapt, soared up into the great church. His body stood still, absorbed by the height. His soul leapt up into the gloom, into possession. It reeled, it swooned with a great escape. It quivered in the womb, in the hush and the gloom of fecundity, like seed of procreation in ecstasy. She too was overcome with wonder and awe. She followed him in his progress. Here, the twilight was the very essence of life. The colored darkness was the embryo of all light and the day. Here, the very first dawn was breaking, the very last sunset sinking, and the immemorial darkness, whereof life's day would blossom and fall away again, re-echoed peace and profound immemorial silence. Away from time, always outside of time, between east and west, between dawn and sunset, the church lay like a seed in silence, dark before germination, silenced after death, containing birth and death, potential with all the noise and transition of life. The cathedral remained hushed, a great, involved seed, whereof the flower would be radiant life inconceivable, but whose beginning and whose end were the circle of silence. Spanned round with the rainbow, the jeweled gloom folded music upon silence, light upon darkness, fecundity upon death, as a seed folds leaf upon leaf and silence upon the root and the flower, hushing up the secret of all between its parts, the death out of which it fell, the life into which it has dropped, the immortality it involves, and the death it will embrace again. Here in the church, before and after, were folded together, all was contained in oneness. Brangwen came to his consummation. Out of the doors of the womb he had come, putting aside the wings of the womb, and proceeding into the light. Through daylight and day after day he had come, knowledge after knowledge, and experience after experience, remembering the darkness of the womb, having prescience of the darkness after death. Then between, while he had pushed open the doors of the cathedral and entered the twilight of both darkness, the hush of the twofold silence where dawn was sunset, and the beginning and the end were one. Here the stone leapt up from the plane of earth, leapt up in a manifold, cluster desire each time, up, away from the horizontal earth, through twilight and dusk and the whole range of desire, through the swerving, the declination, to the ecstasy, the touch, to the meeting and the consummation, the meeting, the clasp, the close embrace, the neutrality, the perfect, swooning consummation, the timeless ecstasy. There his soul remained, at the apex of the arch, clinched in the timeless ecstasy, consummated. And there was no time nor life nor death, but only this timeless consummation, where the thrust from earth met the thrust from earth, and the arch was locked on the keystone of ecstasy. This was all, this was everything, till he came to himself in the world below. Then again he gathered himself together. In transit, every jet of him strained and leaped clear into the darkness above, to the fecundity and the unique mystery, to the touch, the clasp, the consummation, the climax of eternity, the apex of the arch. She too was overcome, but silenced rather than tuned to the place. She loved it as a world not quite her own. She resented his transports and ecstasies. His passion in the cathedral at first awed her, then made her angry. After all, there was the sky outside, and in here, in this mysterious half-night, when his soul leapt with the pillars upwards, it was not to the stars and the crystalline dark space, but to meet and clasp with the answering impulse of leaping stone, there in the dusk and secrecy of the roof. The far-off clinching and mating of the arches, the leap and thrust of the stone, carrying a great roof overhead, awed and silenced her. But yet she remembered that the open sky was no blue vault, no dark dome hung with many twinkling lamps, but a space where stars were wheeling in freedom, with freedom above them always higher. The cathedral roused her too, but she would never consent to the knitting of all the leaping stone in a great roof that closed her in, and beyond which was nothing. It was the ultimate confine. His soul would have liked it to be so. Here is all, complete, eternal, motion, meeting, ecstasy, and no illusion of time, of night and day passing by, but only perfectly proportioned space and movement clinching and renewing, and passion surging its way into great waves to the altar, recurrence of ecstasy. Her soul, too, was carried forward to the altar, to the threshold of eternity, in reverence and fear and joy. But ever she hung back in the transit, mistrusting the culmination of the altar. She was not to be flung forward on the lift and lift of passionate flights, to be cast at last upon the altar steps as upon the shore of the unknown. There was a great joy and a verity in it, but even in the dazed swoon of the cathedral, she claimed another right. The altar was barren, its lights gone out. God burned no more in that bush. It was dead matter lying there. She claimed the right to freedom above her, higher than the roof. She had always a sense of being roofed in, so that she caught at little things, which saved her from being swept forward headlong in the tide of passion that leaps on into the infinite in a great mass, triumphant and flinging its own course. She wanted to get out of this fixed, leaping, forward-traveling movement, to rise from it as a bird rises with wet, limp feet from the sea, to lift herself as a bird lifts its breast and thrusts its body from the pulse and heave of a sea that bears it forward to an unwilling conclusion, tear herself away like a bird on wings, and in open space where there is clarity, rise up above the fixed, surcharged motion. A separate speck that hangs suspended, moves this way and that, seeing and answering, before it sinks again, having chosen or found the direction in which it shall be carried forward. And it was as if she must grasp at something, as if her wings were too weak to lift her straight off the heaving motion. So she caught sight of the wicked, odd little faces carved in stone, and she stood before them arrested. These sly little faces peeped out of the grand tide of the cathedral like something that knew better. They knew quite well, these little imps that retorted on man's own illusion, that the cathedral was not absolute. They winked and leered, giving suggestion of the many things that had been left out of the great concept of the church. However much there is inside here, there's a good deal they haven't got in, the little faces mocked. Apart from the lift and spring of the great impulse towards the altar, these little faces had separate wills, separate motions, separate knowledge, which rippled back in defiance of the tide, and laughed in triumph of their own very littleness. "Oh, look," cried Anna. "Oh, look how adorable the face is. Look at her." Brangwen looked unwillingly. This was the voice of the serpent in his Eden. She pointed him to a plump, sly, malicious little face carved in stone. "He knew her, the man who carved her," said Anna. "I'm sure she was his wife." "It isn't a woman at all, it's a man," said Brangwen curtly. "Do you think so?" "No, that isn't a man. That is no man's face." Her voice sounded rather jeering. He laughed shortly and went on, but she would not go forward with him. She loitered about the carvings, and he could not go forward without her. He waited impatient of this counteraction. She was spoiling his passionate intercourse with the cathedral. His brows began to gather. "Oh, this is good," she cried again. "Here is the same woman, look. Only he's made her cross. Isn't it lovely? Hasn't he made her hideous to a degree?" She laughed with pleasure. Didn't he hate her? He must have been a nice man. Look at her, isn't it awfully good? Just like a shrewish woman. He must have enjoyed putting her in like that. He got his own back on her, didn't he? "It's a man's face, no woman's at all, a monk's clean shaven," he said. She laughed with a poof of laughter. "You hate to think he put his wife in your cathedral, don't you?" She mocked, with a tinkle of profane laughter, and she laughed with malicious triumph. She had got free from the cathedral. She had even destroyed the passion he had. She was glad. He was bitterly angry. Strive as he would, he could not keep the cathedral wonderful to him. He was disillusioned. That which had been his absolute, containing all heaven and earth, was become to him as to her, a shapely heap of dead matter. But dead, dead. His mouth was full of ash. His soul was furious. He hated her for having destroyed another of his vital illusions. Soon he would be stark, stark, without one place wherein to stand, without one belief in which to rest. Yet somewhere in him he responded more deeply to the sly little face that knew better than he had done before to the perfect surge of his cathedral. Nevertheless, for the time being, his soul was wretched and homeless, and he could not bear to think of Anna's ousting him from his beloved realities. He wanted his cathedral. He wanted to satisfy his blind passion. And he could not anymore. Something intervened. They went home again, both of them altered. She had some new reverence for that which he wanted. He felt that his cathedrals would never again be to him as they had been. Before, he had thought them absolute. But now he saw them crouching under the sky, with still the dark, mysterious world of reality inside, but as a world within a world, a sort of sideshow, whereas before they had been as a world to him within a chaos, a reality, an order, an absolute, within a meaningless confusion. He had felt, before, that could he but go through the great door and look down the gloom towards the far-off, concluding wonder of the altar, that then, with the windows suspended around like tablets of jewels, emanating their own glory, then he had arrived. Here the satisfaction he had yearned after came near, towards this, the porch of the great unknown. All reality gathered, and there, the altar was the mystic door, through which all and everything must move on to eternity. But now, somehow, sadly and disillusioned, he realized that the doorway was no doorway. It was too narrow, it was false. Outside the cathedral were many flying spirits that could never be sifted through the jeweled gloom. He had lost his absolute. He listened to the thrushes in the gardens and heard a note which the cathedrals did not include, something free and careless and joyous. He crossed a field that was all yellow with dandelions on his way to work, and the bath of yellow glowing was something at once so sumptuous and so fresh that he was glad he was away from his shadowy cathedral. There was life outside the church. There was much that the church did not include. He thought of God and of the whole blue rotunda of the day. That was something great and free. He thought of the ruins of the Grecian worship, and it seemed a temple was never perfectly a temple till it was ruined and mixed up with the winds and the sky and the herbs. Still, he loved the church. As a symbol, he loved it. He tended it for what it tried to represent, rather than for that which it did represent. Still, he loved it. The little church across his garden wall drew him. He gave it loving attention. But he went to take charge of it, to preserve it. It was as an old, sacred thing to him. He looked after the stone and woodwork, mending the organ and restoring a piece of broken carving, repairing the church furniture. Later, he became choir master also. His life was shifting its center, becoming more superficial. He had failed to become really articulate, failed to find real expression. He had to continue in the old form. But in spirit, he was uncreated. Anna was absorbed in the child now. She left her husband to take his own way. She was willing now to postpone all adventure into unknown realities. She had the child. Her palpable and immediate future was the child. If her soul had found no utterance, her womb had. The church that neighbored with his house became very intimate and dear to him. He cherished it. He had it entirely in his charge. If he could find no new activity, he would be happy cherishing the old, dear form of worship. He knew this little, whitewashed church. In its shadowy atmosphere, he sank back into being. He liked to sink himself in its hush as a stone sinks into water. He went across his garden, mounted the wall by the little steps, and entered the hush and peace of the church. As the heavy door clanged to behind him, his feet re-echoed in the aisle. His heart re-echoed with a little passion of tenderness and mystic peace. He was also slightly ashamed, like a man who has failed, who lapses back for his fulfillment. He loved to light the candles at the organ, and sitting there alone in the little glow, practiced the hymns and chants for the service. The whitewashed arches retreated into darkness. The sound of the organ and the organ pedals died away upon the unalterable stillness of the church. There were faint, ghostly noises in the tower, and then the music swelled out again, loudly, triumphantly. He ceased to fret about his life. He relaxed his will and let everything go. What was between him and his wife was a great thing, if it was not everything. She had conquered really. Let him wait and abide, wait and abide. She and the baby and himself, they were one. The organ rang out his protestation. His soul lay in the darkness as he pressed the keys of the organ. To Anna, the baby was a complete bliss and fulfillment. Her desires sank into abeyance. Her soul was in bliss over the baby. It was rather a delicate child, She had trouble to rear it. She never for a moment thought it would die. It was a delicate infant, therefore it behoved her to make it strong. She threw herself into the labor. The child was everything. Her imagination was all occupied here. She was a mother. It was enough to handle the new little limbs, the new little body, hear the new little voice crying in the stillness. All the future rang to her out of the sound of the babies crying and cooing. She balanced the coming years of life in her hands as she nursed the child. The passionate sense of fulfillment of the future germinated in her, made her vivid and powerful. All the future was in her hands, in the hands of the woman. And before this baby was 10 months old, she was again with child. She seemed to be in the fecund of storm life. Every moment was full and busy with productiveness to her. She felt like the earth, the mother of everything. Brangwen occupied himself with the church. He played the organ, he trained the choir boys, he taught a Sunday school class of youths. He was happy enough. There was an eager, yearning kind of happiness in him as he taught the boys on Sundays. He was all the time exciting himself with the proximity of some secret that he had not yet fathomed.
In the house, he served his wife and the little matriarchy. She loved him because he was the father of her children. And she always had a physical passion for him. So he gave up trying to have the spiritual superiority and control, or even her respect for his conscious or public life. He lived simply by her physical love for him. And he served the little matriarchy, nursing the child and helping with the housework, indifferent any more of his own dignity and importance. But his abandoning of claims, his living isolated upon his own interest, made him seem unreal, unimportant.
Anna was not publicly proud of him, but very soon she learned to be indifferent to public life. He was not what is called a manly man. He did not drink or smoke or arrogate importance. But he was her man, and his very indifference to all claims of manliness set her supreme in her own world with him. Physically, she loved him, and he satisfied her. He went alone and subsidiary always. At first it had irritated her. The outer world existed so little to him. Looking at him with outside eyes, she was inclined to sneer at him. But her sneer changed to a sort of respect. She respected him, that he could serve her so simply and completely. Above all, she loved to bear his children. She loved to be the source of children. She could not understand him, his strange, dark rages, and his devotion to the church. It was the church building he cared for, and yet his soul was passionate for something. He labored cleaning the stonework, repairing the woodwork, restoring the organ, and making the singing as perfect as possible. To keep the church fabric and the church ritual intact was his business, to have the intimate sacred building utterly in his own hands, and to make the form of service complete. There was a little bright anguish and tension on his face, and in his intent movements. He was like a lover who knows he is betrayed, but who still loves, whose love is only the more intense. The church was false, but he served it the more attentively. During the day, at his work in the office, he kept himself suspended. He did not exist. He worked automatically till it was time to go home. He loved with a hot heart the dark-haired little Ursula, and he waited for the child to come to consciousness. Now the mother monopolized the baby, but his heart waited in its darkness. His hour would come. In the long run, he learned to submit to Anna. She forced him to the spirit of her laws, whilst leaving him the letter of his own. She combated in him his devils. She suffered very much from his inexplicable and incalculable dark rages, when a blackness filled him, and a black wind seemed to sweep out of existence everything that had to do with him. She could feel herself, everything, being annihilated by him. At first she fought him. At night, in this state, he would kneel down to say his prayers. She looked at his crouching figure. "Why are you kneeling there, pretending to pray?" she said, harshly. "Do you think anybody can pray when they are in the vile temper you are in?" He remained crouching by the beside, motionless. "It's horrible," she continued, "and such a pretense. What do you pretend you are saying? Who do you pretend you are praying to?" He still remained motionless, seething with inchoate rage, when his whole nature seemed to disintegrate. He seemed to live with a strain upon himself, and occasionally came these dark, chaotic rages, the lust for destruction. She then fought with him, and their fights were horrible, murderous. And then the passion between them came just as black and awful. But little by little, as she learned to love him better, she would put herself aside, and when she felt one of his fits upon him, would ignore him, successfully leave him in his world, whilst she remained in her own. He had a black struggle with himself to come back to her, for at last he learned that he would be in hell until he came back to her. So he struggled to submit to her, and she was afraid of the ugly strain in his eyes. She made love to him and took him. Then he was grateful to her love, humble. He made himself a woodwork shed in which to restore things which were destroyed in the church. So he had plenty to do: his wife, his child, the church, the woodwork, and his wage earning, all occupying him. If only there were not some limit to him, some darkness across his eyes. He had to give in to it at last himself. He must submit to his own inadequacy, aware of some limit to himself, of something unformed in his own black, violent temper, and to reckon with it. But as she was more gentle with him, it became quieter. As he sat sometimes very still, with a bright, vacant face, Anna could see the suffering among the brightness. He was aware of some limit to himself, of something unformed in his very being, of some buds which were not ripe in him, some folded centers of darkness which would never develop and unfold whilst he was alive in the body. He was unready for fulfillment. Something undeveloped in him limited him. There was a darkness in him which he could not unfold, which would never unfold in him.
8.
The child. From the first, the baby stirred in the young father a deep, strong emotion he dared scarcely acknowledge. It was so strong and came out of the dark of him. When he heard the child cry, a terror possessed him because of the answering echo from the unfathomed distances in himself. Must he know in himself such distances, perilous and imminent? He had the infant in his arms. He walked backwards and forwards, troubled by the crying of his own flesh and blood. This was his own flesh and blood crying. His soul rose against the voice suddenly breaking out from him, from the distances in him. Sometimes in the night, the child cried and cried, when the night was heavy and sleep oppressed him. And half asleep, he stretched out his hand to put it over the baby's face to stop the crying. But something arrested his hand. The very inhumanness of the intolerable, continuous crying arrested him. It was so impersonal, without cause or object. Yet he echoed to it directly. His soul answered its madness. It filled him with terror, almost with frenzy. He learned to acquiesce to this, to submit to the awful, obliterated sources which were the origin of his living tissue. He was not what he conceived himself to be. Then he was what he was, unknown, potent, dark. He became accustomed to the child. He knew how to lift and balance the little body. The baby had a beautiful, rounded head that moved him passionately. He would have fought to the last drop to defend that exquisite, perfect round head. He learned to know the little hands and feet, the strange, unseeing, golden brown eyes, the mouth that opened only to cry, or to suck, or to show a queer, toothless laugh. He could almost understand even the dangling legs, which at first had created in him a feeling of aversion. They could kick in their queer little way. They had their own softness. One evening, suddenly, he saw the tiny, living thing rolling naked in the mother's lap, and he was sick. It was so utterly helpless and vulnerable and extraneous. In a world of hard surfaces and varying altitudes, it lay vulnerable and naked at every point. Yet it was quite blithe. And yet, in its blind, awful crying, was there not the blind, far-off terror of its own vulnerable nakedness, the terror of being so utterly delivered over, helpless at every point? He could not bear to hear it crying. His heart strained and stood on guard against the whole universe. But he waited for the dread of these days to pass. He saw the joy coming. He saw the lovely, creamy, cool little ear of the baby, a bit of dark hair rubbed to a bronze floss like bronze dust. and he waited for the child to become his, to look at him and answer him. It had a separate being, but it was his own child. His flesh and blood vibrated to it. He caught the baby to his breast with his passionate, clapping laugh, and the infant knew him. As the newly opened, newly dawned eyes looked at him, he wanted them to perceive him, to recognize him. Then he was verified. The child knew him. A queer contortion of laughter came on its face for him. He caught it to his breast, clapping with a triumphant laugh. The golden brown eyes of the child gradually lit up and dilated at the sight of the dark glowing face of the youth. It knew its mother better. It wanted its mother more. But the brightest, sharpest little ecstasy was for the father. It began to be strong, to move vigorously and freely, to make sounds like words. It was a baby girl now. Already it knew his strong hands. It exulted in his strong clasp. It laughed and crowed when he played with it. And his heart grew red-hot with passionate feeling for the child. She was not much more than a year old when the second baby was born. Then he took Ursula for his own. She his first little girl. He had set his heart on her. The second had dark blue eyes and a fair skin. It was more a Brangwen, people said. The hair was fair, but they forgot Anna's stiff blonde fleece of childhood. They called the newcomer Gudrun. This time, Anna was stronger and not so eager. She did not mind that the baby was not a boy. It was enough that she had milk and could suckle her child. Oh, the bliss of the little life sucking the milk of her body. Oh, the bliss, as the infant grew stronger, of the two tiny hands clutching, catching blindly yet passionately at her breast, of the tiny mouth seeking her in blind, sure, vital knowledge, of the sudden consummate peace as the little body sank, the mouth and throat sucking, drinking life from her to make a new life, almost sobbing with passionate joy of receiving its own existence. The tiny hands clutching frantically as the nipple was drawn back, not to be gainsaid. This was enough for Anna. She seemed to pass off into a kind of rapture of motherhood. Her rapture of motherhood was everything. So that the father had the elder baby, the weaned child, the golden brown, wondering vivid eyes of the little Ursula were for him, who had waited behind the mother till the need was for him. The mother felt a sharp stab of jealousy, but she was still more absorbed in the tiny baby. It was entirely hers. Its need was direct upon her. So Ursula became the child of her father's heart. She was the little blossom, he was the sun. He was patient, energetic, inventive for her. He taught her all the funny little things. He filled her and roused her to her fullest tiny measure. She answered him with her extravagant infant's laughter and her call of delight. Now there were two babies. A woman came in to do the housework. Anna was holy nurse. Two babies were not too much for her. But she hated any form of work. Now her children had come, except the charge of them. When Ursula toddled about, she was an absorbed, busy child, always amusing herself, needing not much attention from other people. At evening, towards 6 o'clock, Anna very often went across the lane to the stile, lifted Ursula over into the field with a "Go and meet Daddy." Then Brangwen, coming up the steep round of the hill, would see before him on the brow of the path a tiny, tottering, wind-blown little mite with a dark head, who, as soon as she saw him, would come running in tiny, wild, windmill fashion, lifting her arms up and down to him, down the steep hill. His heart leapt up. He ran his fastest to her, to catch her, because he knew she would fall. She came fluttering on, wildly, with her little limbs flying, and he was glad when he caught her up in his arms. Once she fell as she came flying to him. He saw her pitch forward suddenly as she was running with her hands lifted to him, and when he picked her up, her mouth was bleeding. He could never bear to think of it. He always wanted to cry, even when he was an old man and she had become a stranger to him. How he loved that little Ursula. His heart had been sharply seared for her when he was a youth, first married. When she was a little older, he would see her recklessly climbing over the bars of the stile, in her red pinafore, swinging in peril and tumbling over, picking herself up and flitting towards him. Sometimes she liked to ride on his shoulder. Sometimes she preferred to walk with his hand. Sometimes she would fling her arms round his legs for a moment, then race free again, whilst he went shouting and calling to her, a child along with her. He was still only a tall, thin, unsettled lad of 22. It was he who had made her her cradle, her little chair, her little stool, her high chair. It was he who would swing her up to table, or who would make for her a doll out of an old table leg, whilst she watched him, saying, "Make her eyes, Daddy, make her eyes." And he made her eyes with his knife. She was very fond of adorning herself, so he would tie a piece of cotton round her ear and hang a blue bead on it underneath for an earring. The earrings varied with a red bead and a golden bead and a little pearl bead. And as he came home at night, seeing her bridling and looking very self-conscious, he took notice and said, "So you're wearing your best golden and pearl earrings today?" "Yes." "I suppose you've been to see the Queen?" "Yes, I have." "Oh, and what had she to say?" She said, "You won't dirty your nice white frock." He gave her the nicest bits from his plate, putting them into her red, moist mouth. And he would make on a piece of bread and butter a bird out of jam, which she ate with extraordinary relish. After the tea things were washed up, the woman went away, leaving the family free. Usually Brangwen helped in the bathing of the children. He held long discussions with his child as she sat on his knee, and he unfastened her clothes. And he seemed to be talking really of momentous things, deep moralities. Then suddenly she ceased to hear, having caught sight of a glass he rolled into a corner. She slipped away and was in no hurry to return. "Come back here," he said, waiting. She became absorbed, taking no notice. "Come on," he repeated, with a touch of command. An excited little chuckle came from her, but she pretended to be absorbed. "Do you hear, milady?" She turned with a fleeting, exulting laugh. He rushed on her and swept her up. "Who is it that didn't come?" he said, rolling her between his strong hands, tickling her. And she laughed heartily, heartily. She loved him that he compelled her with his strength and decision. He was all-powerful, the tower of strength which rose out of her sight. When the children were in bed, sometimes Anna and he sat and talked desultorily, both of them idle. He read very little. Anything he was drawn to read became a burning reality to him, another scene outside his window, whereas Anna skimmed through a book to see what happened. Then she had enough. Therefore they would often sit together, talking desultorily. What was really between them, they could not utter. Their words were only accidents in the mutual silence. When they talked, they gossiped. She did not care for sewing. She had a beautiful way of sitting musing, gratefully, as if her heart were lit up. Sometimes she would turn to him, laughing, to tell him some little thing that had happened during the day. Then he would laugh. They would talk a while, before the vital, physical silence was between them again. She was thin but full of color and life. She was perfectly happy to do just nothing, only to sit with a curious, languid dignity, so careless as to be almost regal, so utterly indifferent, so confident. The bond between them was undefinable, but very strong. It kept everyone else at a distance. His face never changed whilst she knew him. It only became more intense. It was ruddy and dark in its abstraction, not very human. It had a strong, intent brightness. Sometimes, when his eyes met hers, a yellow flash from them caused a darkness to swoon over her consciousness, electric, and a slight strange laugh came on his face. Her eyes would turn languidly, then close as if hypnotized, and they lapsed into the same potent darkness. He had the quality of a young black cat, intent, unnoticeable, and yet his presence gradually made itself felt, stealthily and powerfully took hold of her. He called, not to her, but to something in her, which responded subtly, out of her unconscious darkness. So they were together in a darkness, passionate, electric, forever haunting the back of the common day, never in the light. In the light, he seemed to sleep unknowing. Only she knew him when the darkness set him free, and he could see with his gold-glowing eyes his intention and his desires in the dark. Then she was in a spell. Then she answered his harsh, penetrating call with a soft leap of her soul. The darkness woke up, electric, bristling with an unknown, overwhelming insinuation. By now they knew each other. She was the daytime, the daylight. He was the shadow, put aside, but in the darkness potent with an overwhelming voluptuousness. She learned not to dread and to hate him, but to fill herself with him, to give herself to his black, sensual power that was hidden all the day.